Good to see everyone tonight. Another beautiful day. A couple of things I wanted to mention on the lighter side. Remember Reader's Digest used to have a section. I don't even know if that magazine is still published or not, but it used to have a section called the lighter side. And it was things that happened or people had seen or noticed or whatnot that was amusing. And I've seen a couple of signs lately in some of our travels that kind of struck me as being somewhat amusing. I think it was in downtown York. There's a restaurant that had a sign out front. And apparently they had had some problems with kids running in and out or being a little disruptive. So the sign they had posted out front was, "Unattended children will be taught to swear and will be given a puppy." So that was meant to be an incentive for the parents to take care of their kids. Also, I've forgotten where it was on our trip to Lads to Leaders, but many times people have one of these tall, narrow signs on their porch next to the front door where the word welcome will be spelled out. Well, I saw one. I guess people must have solicited a lot in that neighborhood. It said, "Go away." And I don't have an Apple Watch. Many of you probably do, but I understand there's one of the functions of the watch is that it can detect when the sound, or I guess decibel levels, get so high, it'll give you a warning. And I've seen that go off with people twice within the last couple of months. One of them was during the Men's Day. A speaker got up to speak, and we'd just gotten through singing, I think, Our God, He is Alive. And his watch went off during the singing. So he got up and mentioned that. And then as the leaders during the awards presentation, Robert and Emily were behind us. And he said, "My watch just went off." It was because it was so loud in there that it set it off. So I thought that's kind of an interesting thing. But our study now is we're going to continue on talking about the fullness of time. And we're building all these parts that are coming together and point to and help us to understand why the time that Christ was born was, as Paul described, the most appropriate time. It was the fullness of time. The world was ready. And so far we've been talking about a lot of things that work towards that, and we'll continue that today. And next week we'll do something a little different. We'll study from the Bible instead. But we're going to look at Malachi, because that was God's last written message to his people before that period of 400 plus years where he did not speak with them specifically as far as a new message goes until the timing of the next prophet, who was, of course, John the Baptist. So we'll kind of pick up where we left off last week, or actually it was 2 weeks ago. And we were talking about the different religions that came up in civilization as time grew. And this is a chart, probably can't read everything, but the very top line is just sections of time, except for the first one. It's basically 500-year sections. And the purple row are God's peoples, starting with of course, creation, the flood, and going through Abraham, through Joseph, then the Exodus and the divided kingdom, and finally Malachi in the intertestamental period, the last column headed by the purple. The second row is Ishmael, and the people followed him. Of course, Ishmael was the first son of Abraham and a half-brother to Isaac. And God promised him that he would have people, but he was kind of a wild sort, and somewhat hostile to his neighbors and whatnot. But off to the right, after the coming of Christ, is when Muhammad drew all these followers of Ishmael together, and this is the basis for the Muslim religion. And the orangish color, of course, Egypt, and they believed that they had hundreds and hundreds of gods, and they kind of came and went in popularity. And many of them were based on certain things, usually they either didn't understand or they couldn't explain. like the sun was a god, or the underworld was a god. And they had these things that I guess it's just natural. If you can't really explain it or understand it, well, it must be something mystical or beyond my power. And we might have those tendencies as well, and we'll mention that a little later. But they have been around for a good while. But one thing you'll notice about this chart, that a lot of the newer religions are off to the right. There are things that man kind of created in their own mind over time. It includes the Confucianism, which was basically more of a religious philosophy rather than worshiping a god. Hinduism, very similar. It was a way of life rather than a true religion. And Buddhism, which arose out of Hinduism, was very similar. No supreme deity or being, but they focused on personal wisdom, on enlightenment, inner peace, and things of this sort. And the green one is the Greek, and they believed in mythical gods. And oftentimes those gods would have human characteristics. They were related oftentimes. They would argue, they would fuss, they would cheat. They kind of seems like they're modeled after people rather than people being modeled after or trying to follow God. And then the last row, the yellow, was the Romans. And they had many gods as well. But their philosophy was, there's a God that's helping me in my military conquest. And God, if you'll help me, then I'll worship you and I'll sacrifice to you and things of that sort. So it's kind of a you help me, I'll help you type of a situation. And I think it was Barry had mentioned it 2 weeks ago that some of the similarities to this is what we see in the way a lot of people feel today. And that is, it's based more on me, self-enlightenment, my own wisdom. I'm going to do things my way. This is how I think things work. It doesn't matter what someone else used to think or tried to explain it. It's a self-philosophy of life. And that's where I think sometimes the environment can come into it, where people can look upon Mother Nature as a god. Not so much that you don't understand it, but there's a lot of wonder to it. Oh, it's just beautiful. And it is. But we just got to remember that God created that. It's not something that's self-contained or self-perpetuating forever and ever. Also, when we feel enlightened, we have the tendency to feel like there is no really right or wrong. Everybody's acceptable the way they are. We just got to change our way of thinking. And also with the Greek gods being more like people, it might have people feel more like, well, I'm not so bad. I mean, if the Greek gods, if they argue, I kind of argue, well, if they can do it, so can I. So, it's just different ways of looking at it. But I thought this chart was somewhat informative in that, as you go from left to right, we're going through time. We're getting closer and closer to Jesus, and things are becoming more and more mixed up, more and more me, rather than God. And we see that today. And of course, how much more could it be where if man is going through this evolution, that we need God? And that's when Jesus came and set us straight. Any comments so far? I do want to caution us about something, and it struck me after thinking last time, is that when we're looking at some of these religions, we never want to have the attitude of holier than thou, or I know and you don't know, you're mistaken. Because we can fall into that trap if we're not careful. Because many of us were there at one point in our lives. And we are fortunate enough to have someone have the interest to tell us the way it really is and explain it to us. And so we don't want to ever, kind of poo-poo the way they feel, or, what's the matter with you? Why can't you understand it? We don't want to have that type of a relationship or an attitude. Because we have been privileged in having someone explain to us the real way. But I think when we're thinking about Jesus and what he faced in the fullness of time, he primarily addressed the Jews, but still, they certainly were influenced by the different peoples around them. And no doubt they succumbed to some of this. You know, it's kind of nice. It makes you feel good that, well, it's like Frank Sinatra, I did it my way. You know, he was proud of that. You know, maybe no one else agreed with it, but it was my way. And, you know, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and all that kind of stuff. And that has some positive things, but our own ways rarely is it the right way. And Jesus knew that his disciples would face a lot of these kinds of teachings and tendencies and whatnot, and they needed to be aware of it. So again, all these things are kind of building to the time that would be just right for our Lord to come to this earth. But also it means that because some of the teaching techniques that the disciples used, it can apply to us today because our world is very similar, where we've got a lot of different attitudes. So we don't have to reinvent a lot of stuff. We can just see how they did it in the first century, and we can be assured that it'll work. Another religion we read about all the time in the Old Testament, but we don't seem to talk too much about, and that's Baal worship. And in some ways, I'm really impressed with Baal worship. Now, I know that sounds kind of strange, but I'll explain why I feel that way. It really isn't mentioned at all in the New Testament. In fact, it only shows up once, and that's when Paul was referring to Elijah and how he's kind of lamented that, I'm the only one left. And God said that I've got 7,000 knees that have not yet, or people have not bowed the knee to Baal. And that's really the only time we'll see that God mentioned in the New Testament. But some commentators feel that the Greek equivalent to Baal was Zeus. You know, he was the top god in their hierarchy, or Jupiter was the top god in the Roman one. But some people think that Baal evolved into these two Greek and Roman gods. But we don't see it much in the New, but it was very prevalent in the Old Testament. Just some real quick facts about Baal. He was the chief god of the Canaanites. Of course, Canaan was the area that was basically the promised land. So they were one of several inhabitants of that area. Baal means owner or lord. And he was considered to be the god of fertility, of earth and rain and storms. And he was in mortal combat against another god called Mot, who was in charge of droughts and death and sterility. So you've got one god for growing things, rain and fertility, and another one for droughts and sterility, and they're fighting. And the thought was that, well, if Baal won, then you'd have 7 years of good crops. And if Mot won, then you have 7 years of drought. And we know a lot of the stories in the Old Testament, a drought was something that really affected people. It caused them either to have extreme hardships, or we know several stories where they had to move just to be able to survive. So when God, through Elijah, stopped a drought 3.5 years after it began, that was really a slap in the face against Mot, because it was supposed to last 7 years. And all of a sudden, we've got a God that's even stronger than Mot. So it really influenced them. So God demonstrated it. But look at how many times the worship of Baal was brought up in the Old Testament. It seems like the Jews they're all excited and they were going along with God, and then they kind of peel off, and you don't know what happened to them. But it always seems like there's somebody out there worshiping Baal, whereas God's people kind of went up and down like this. And if we look at 1 Kings chapter 18, this is just of course, the story we're all familiar with when it comes to Elijah and the Baal worshipers. But I wanted to point out a couple things that So starting in verse 20 in chapter 18 of 1 Kings. So Ahab sent for all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets together on Mount Carmel. And Elijah came to all the people and said, how long will you falter between the two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people answered him not a word. So he gathered together all the children of Israel, and he gave them a challenge. And they didn't say anything. They didn't say, oh, I'm all for God, or even just some of them, but none of them said anything at all. And yet farther down the story, we see where, there's that challenge where he had 2 bulls put on the altars, and Elijah told the Baal priests, and they had, 450 of them there. It says, call on your God to come down and light it. And they did all kinds of things, all day long, cut themselves, danced around, called on God, their God, to come down. But what did the children of Israel do? They didn't say a thing. So that's why, to me, I'm somewhat impressed with the followers. At least they're enthusiastic. They wanted to do something. They're wrong. They're just wasting their breath. But in their own minds, they're doing something that was hopefully going to be positive. And of course, we know the story about how God certainly triumphed, where he sent fire down from heaven, and then all those priests were killed. But then that's kind of like, oh, God won, so I'm on God's side now. So, since the victory is there, the Jews just sometimes seem to really be wishy-washy. And, of course, that's not the way we want to be. Maybe another strange subject to talk about, David and Goliath moments. Now, we're talking about the fullness of time. Why would you talk about David and Goliath? Well, I thought maybe that's an appropriate introduction to situations where we're facing seemingly impossible or insurmountable odds. When we're in a situation where it's just, I don't see how I can win, or it's really going to take a monumental effort because my enemy or what I'm trying to accomplish is so great. And we can think of a number of them. Of course, David and Goliath is one. Gideon, he faced what he thought was, I don't know how this is going to happen. Of course, we talked about Elijah and the Baal. But I also thought about Jesus' disciples. When Jesus said, just like the sign says here, to go, think about his disciples. Many of them were fishermen. Probably the Sea of Galilee was about the only area they really were familiar with. Levi or Matthew was a tax collector. His sphere of traveling or whatnot was probably somewhat limited as well. But here is Jesus telling them to go into all the world, and they probably never traveled 100 miles in their whole life. Go to the whole world. I mean, to me, that's a David and Goliath moment, where somebody who has had a very limited experience is told or is faced with a challenge of going something like that. So I thought we might look at Israel as they're growing as a nation was also facing a similar challenge. Probably can't read this, but this is just the areas in red that were occupied by these different civilizations. And the first one being Babylon. That's a relatively small area, but it really indicates and illustrates the what used to be called, or still is called, I guess, the Fertile Crescent. And one thing that really shaped the countries and civilizations back then, and that were deserts. They were just really formidable. So they would avoid them and go way around them if they had to. In fact, remember when we were studying Daniel, I think it was last year, when Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem, he got word that his father had died. So he was really worried about the throne and his position on the throne being overtaken by people when he was away. So he tried to get or went back to Babylon the quickest way he possibly could, and that was straight across the desert from Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem and Babylon are about on the same latitude, but you typically had to go up and come down again. But he went due east. And let's see, he covered 650 miles in 13 days, he and his soldiers, which is 50 miles a day across the desert. Now, they're probably riding camels or horses or something, and some probably ran. But that's a pretty good clip, where the captives from Jerusalem went the normal route, went north and then down along the Euphrates River. Now, they traveled 1,000 miles, but it took them 2 months. So they only traveled about 16 miles a day. So it took them 5 times as long to travel as it did Babylon. So the deserts were really formidable, and you didn't want to have to cross them unless you had to. So from an acreage, or we're going to talk some about square miles and some of the sizes of these, it's somewhat misleading because a lot of those areas are in desert. But still, I think it's a good proxy to make the comparison that we're going to look at. So the top one is Babylon, or Babylonia, so it was fairly small. And Persia was the second one down, a little wider, a little farther to the east, and got down into Egypt. And then you have the Greeks is the third one down, kind of favored more to the east. And the last one, the lowest one, is Rome, the red area that Rome controlled. And they reached all the way up into England. So it got larger and larger. But you can't help but notice that every one of those went through Israel. And it's kind of like in real estate, location, location, location. In this case, in some ways, it really hurt Israel. In some ways, it really helped them. But whenever one country like Persia went to attack Egypt, they had to go through Israel. So why don't we conquer these guys along the way? When Egypt expanded and they wanted to go north, because it's nothing but desert on either side of the Nile, so they wanted to go north to capture something, they went through Israel. So, they're just kind of in the middle of things. So good or bad, they're usually in trouble. So, and we'll see why that actually helped out the benefits in some ways. But Israel is right in the middle. Oftentimes, we know about the Assyrians. As they went down to Egypt to conquer Egypt, they captured the northern tribes. When Nebuchadnezzar wanted to expand his kingdom, he captured and destroyed Jerusalem, as well as the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. But I thought we'd make a comparison. Not real distinct, but this was the original allotment of the tribes to the areas. When they went into the Promised Land and they occupied Canaan, of course, each of the sons of Israel or Jacob were allotted certain territories, except, of course, for Levi, and they lived in different places, being the priesthood. But we have the northern tribes and the southern tribes. Of course, when you had a divided kingdom, you had Judah and Benjamin in the lower one. But I thought it was kind of interesting that darker green color towards the bottom of the slide. I believe that's Simeon. Yeah. I always wondered about that, where usually you're thought about the northern tribes were the 10 tribes of Israel, and the southern tribes were the 2 tribes. And yet there's one of the tribes that's even farther south than Judah and Benjamin, and that was Simeon. So, we usually think of the northern tribes and the southern tribes, and yet the southernmost tribe is one of the northern tribes. So I always thought that was a little different. But, and I'm not sure how that came about. Maybe just because we generalize when it comes north and south, and there's some. But that was the division. So in the next, this was the greatest extent of Israel. This is after David's conquest and Solomon did it. And it's kind of neat. We mentioned it last, but I'm doing it wrong. Here we go. That may not show up real well. There it is. But that is the Euphrates River. And last time we got together, we mentioned where the term Hebrew came from. I talked by Abraham, the Hebrew, and it means the man from beyond the river. And they're talking about the Euphrates. So the Euphrates River is something that was a boundary that was used as a boundary time and time again. And looking back in Deuteronomy chapter 11, starting in verse 22. For if you carefully keep all these commandments which I command you to do, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and to hold fast to him, then the Lord will drive out all of these nations from before you, and you will dispossess greater and mightier nations than yourselves. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours, from the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates. So there's God telling his people before they go into the promised land, you're going to occupy all this land all the way north to the Euphrates River. And what do you know? That's what they did. That's as far as they reached. And of course, that was long before David actually carried out his military exploits. But something I thought was kind of interesting as well. Well, how big is Israel? Yeah, in terms of land area goes, and this is square miles. So again, the first row is tribal Israel. Basically, it's that, how the different tribes receive the allotments. So that's what we're referring to there. So it's about 12,000 square miles, about the size of Maryland. Then we've got David's Israel. That's this one, David and Solomon's. That's how big, that's the largest Israel ever was. It was only about 26,000 square miles, about the size of West Virginia. How about modern day Israel? Well, we talk about the 1967 war and whatnot when they fought. They're a lot smaller than they were in David's time. And they're about the size of New Jersey. So think of the small country that all these people kept going through, but it wasn't a very big nation. In fact, this will even explain it more. The red area was Babylon. Remember, we looked at the map, it was really just kind of a small area. The light blue color is Persia, and the green is the Greek, the yellow the Romans. And these are all square miles. And it kind of looks black, but it's navy blue up in that corner, is the size of the lower 48 states. But if you look at that pie chart, Persia, Greece, Rome, and the lower 48s are all pretty much the same as when it comes to size. But right there is Israel. In fact, to make something show up, I added the three things together just to get a color up there. So to me, that's David and Goliath. Look at Israel, what they were facing with these countries that would conquer and down them. So strictly from a size-wise, look what they are facing. They're really being challenged. And yet this is where, these are God's people. This is where the Savior of all of mankind is going to be born and grow up and influence everything else. So to me, that's quite a David and Goliath type of a relationship. And again, when Jesus told his disciples to go, if they were thinking about Rome and how extensive that was, and they probably had no way of even visualizing how big Rome was, that was quite a challenge. So again, thinking of the fullness of time, when an Israelite, thinking of his country versus all the challenges they've had in the history and the size of things, it's just overwhelming. But it just makes it how much more amazing when Christ came. that he accomplished. And we know that God's word at one point, at least, was disseminated across the entire world. And, what a feat. And I think that ought to make us amazed and wondered and just, boy, what a God we have. So I thought I'd stop there and see if there's any comments or thoughts about that. But that kind of struck me as being quite revealing.
It's astonishing when you think about all of these empires. They looked at God's people, even the lower 48, right? They're looking at God's people as troublemakers. Where in Rome, they affected just how the governors would govern those areas of Rome. In our United States, Christians are looked at in some groups as troublemakers. But there's such a big impact from God's people in every one of these empires that it's really astonishing the power of God and his word and what we are able to do and his people are able to do when they follow his word and they follow his command. It's really, really astonishing to see. Even though we are the smallest, we can affect massive areas. And the thinking of these rulers and the thinking of, man, we need to pay attention to this sect or these people or the Christians, because if we don't, they'll bring an uprising, and it's really astonishing.
It is, and throughout history, and when you have the feeling of if God is for us, who can be against us, then you can face challenges such as that, or at least maintain your belief, or even though you might be thinking you're having an Elijah moment where I'm the only one, and you really aren't, but sometimes we feel that way. But still, like you say, it is amazing.
I think also what stands out to me is that God said in the fullness of time, he didn't say when you are the greatest, when you are the largest. He said when I appoint, then it will happen. And that's how that's the mindset we have.
And that's, I think, one of the other takeaways of this is exactly that, as Keith said, that we don't have to, in other people's eyes or other ways of measuring things, we don't have to be the biggest and the strongest. That if God's on our side, it's going to happen. God will make it happen. And same thing with the church. It started with just a few people, and it just exploded and covered the entire known world there in a relatively short period of time. I guess we've been going backwards ever since, but we ought to be amazed at what God has done for us when we look at history and what God has done for people in the past, and be reassured of him continuing to bless and help us in doing the right things. I thought it might be, we've got a little bit of time. In the Old Testament, you heard of all kinds of peoples that populated the areas around that, and they influenced them as well. We'll go through this relatively quickly, but again, if you're colorblind, this may be somewhat of a challenge to you, but we've heard of people like Uriah the Hittite. Well, who are the Hittites? Where did they come from? So I thought just briefly we go through that. And but Uriah, it didn't show up on the other map. That was basically Turkey and in northern Syria. So that's where the Hittites were from. And of course, the Amorites, they were troublesome nomads, and they were over around Babylon. And Hammurabi was a descendant of those people. Then you had the Ammonites, who were in the green color. Again, this is Jerusalem. It's not real distinct, but so think of all these other countries in relation to Jerusalem. The Ammonites were descendants of Ben-Ami. I always thought of Bon-Ami, the stuff you used to clean your sinks with. But he was one of the sons of Lot. The Moabites, they are descendants of another son of Lot. The Edomites, they were the descendants of Esau. You can remember Jacob and Esau. Well, God promised that I'm going to give you a land when Esau was kind of out of the picture. But when the Israelites left Egypt, the Edomites would not allow them to go through their country. You're going to have to go around. And then they gloated when the Babylonians conquered Israel. So God said, okay, that's it for you guys. And Malachi mentioned, and I think it was Obadiah also mentioned that as far as the Edomites go, your time is over. The Jebusites, they were kind of the pinkish color. They were a Canaanite tribe that inhabited the area around Jerusalem. So they were some of the people that when Joshua and them went in there, they were supposed to, totally kick out. The Philistines, we think of those. They potentially, they think, came from Crete, which is this island right around here. So they traveled over here. And they were a seafaring people, good navigators, good traders. But they attempted to expand farther inland. That's why they clashed with Samson, because he wasn't along the coast. Then you have the Phoenicians, which were also seafaring traders. The Canaanites were around, of course, the Promised Land. The Amalekites. Then we have the Midianites. So all of these people were all the way around. The Midianites are even farther. Well, they're down right here. So you can see that Israel was surrounded by all these people. Many of them were relatives, distant relatives, but sons of Lot and Esau and whatnot. But they're always causing trouble. And you can remember so many times God in His Word would list all these people. And yet they influenced what their life was like. And they were tribes and cultures that would have to be conquered or at least dealt with. But when it comes to the time of Christ, their cultures and whatnot added to the complexity of what the world was like. Glare, only about 5 minutes. We might go through part of this and then finish it up next week. So when it comes to all these civilizations we're talking about, what did they contribute towards the fullness of time? And of course that wasn't their intention. They were just living their lives. But as time went on, they developed a lot of different things. Sometimes it was related to science, some social aspects. But we can see as we pile all these together how it worked towards the coming of Christ. And you start about Abraham. Let's see. We'll go to this one. Of course, Abraham left, and his father and his family left the Ur of Chaldees, which there's Ur right there. And they wanted to go over here to Canaan. Again, about on the same latitude, but you got to cross the desert. So they went up here and then down. And they stopped in Haran, which is right there. So they actually, Abram and his family traveled more than halfway before they stopped in Haran. And one thing I always thought was kind of interesting, if we look at Genesis 11:31, this is where Abram and his father and the rest of the family traveled. Let's see, starting in verse 31. And this is Abram's father, Terah. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. That always struck me that, sometimes you think of Abraham leaving the Ur of the Chaldees to go to Canaan, but it was his father who left the Ur to go to Canaan. So I don't know if God, and it doesn't say, if God says, Abraham's father, you need to go to Canaan, or if it was just wild hair or exactly what it was, but something got them on the way and they stopped in Haran, and it was while Abraham was there when God called him to go the rest of the way. But I always thought it was interesting that it wasn't necessarily Abraham that was instructed while he lived in Ur to go to Canaan, but he went along with his father and the rest of the family, and they stopped along the way. But it was in that general area where we hear about Hammurabi. You know, this is Mesopotamia between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and you've probably heard of Hammurabi and the Hammurabi Code. Well, the thing that's most amazing and contributed the most, they're saying that the Code of Hammurabi can be viewed as he was the first leader in recorded history to codify a unified system of government. And Mark talked this morning about Romans 13, and we don't always view the government as being so great and all that, but it's a positive thing. And a good, being governed by a government, good or bad, versus anarchy, it's still a whole lot better. But this is the first time they had a system of government and of justice, of laws, of punishment and whatnot. So you think of how that contributes and how it grew up towards what Christ was born into in the Roman times. It was interesting that it sounds like regulations in this country, they also had price supports and minimum wages according to history. It's, you know, you think of that's something this country invented, but apparently not so. And so that was interesting. It looks like we're right close to 6 o'clock. So this might be a good place to end, and we'll start there. And then we'll get into Malachi next week as well. But again, all this talk is really just trying to build up to say how amazing God is and his plans, and whether we're ever aware of it or not, he's working for our benefit. So let's have a prayer before we leave. Holy Father, thank you so much for this beautiful day you've given us, for the times in the past that we've enjoyed and enjoyed each other's company, but especially have enjoyed and benefited from your word and your power and your influence on all of us, Father. Pray we'll have a safe week, that we can improve other people's lives and hopefully encourage them in one way or another to seek you. Thank you for your love and your protection and your grace. It's in our Savior's name we pray. Amen.